ایران ای مرز پرگوهر، ای خاک از سرچشمه هنر، دور از تو اندیشه بدان، آینده مانی تو جاودان.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of this series on modern Iran. Today we'll be looking at what are called Persia's Days of Rage, this period of extreme ultra-revolutionary violence in the aftermath of the Shah's attempted counter-revolution against the constitutionalists. So unfortunately, Hunger the Dye Merchant, my good co-host for this series, he was originally supposed to be with me today as he normally is, but something's come up and so I'll be soldiering on alone. And just to recap, so last time we were looking at the origins and the course of events of the constitutional revolution, whereby a broad swath of Iranian society, from reformist mullahs, Bazari merchants, aspects of the common people, tribesmen and intellectuals had all come together, forming a grand coalition to pressure for political reform. They are tacitly aided by the British by being allowed to take refuge in the British consulate. Their pressure is enough to get the creation of a majlis, or parliament, and the passing of Iran's very first constitution. And however, radicals within the constitutional sort of coalition push for even more change, and they're able to get a significant sort of defanging of the House of Qajar by having a lot of the wealth of the dynasty cut off from itself. And obviously with the death of Muzaffar ad-Din Shah in 1907, his son Muhammad Ali Shah comes to the throne, and he is someone who ultimately would not be very happy with the situation and look to restore his royal privileges and prerogatives. And so it's this sort of period known as the Minor Tyranny from 1908 to 1909, and its aftermath that we'll be looking at today. And so to get us started, I will be doing a reading from the Modern Iran book I've been relying on by Abbas Armanat. So, the coup and the destruction of the Majlis. In February 1908, 2 bombs were thrown at Muhammad Ali Shah's cavalcade. At least 4 were killed, and the royal automobile, one of the earliest in Iran, was damaged, but the Shah escaped unharmed. The failed assassination, apparently masterminded by Haider Khan and carried out by Azerbaijani emigres from Baku, made the Shah even less secure about his survival on the throne. His suspicions were aggravated as rumours circulated in Tehran of the candidacy to the throne of his uncle, Prince Zel al-Sultan, whose raw ambitions for the Qajar throne were long the subject of popular speculation. It was starkly clear that the Qajar nobility, afraid for their own survival, were no longer unanimously behind the Shah. As early as mid-1907, radical constitutionalists, especially in Tabriz, called on the Majlis and the public to remove Muhammad Ali Shah from power. The revolutionary newspapers and preachers were no less shy. By early 1908, it appeared that an armed confrontation between the parties was inevitable. In fear of the revolutionaries armed with light weapons, especially in Azerbaijan, the Shah was encouraged by his Iranian generals and his former Russian tutor, by then his advisor, to react. More decisively, the Russian commander of the Cossack Brigade, Colonel Vladimir Lyakov, was able to persuade the Shah that destruction of the Majlis and the Majluteh was the only way out. Lyakov, a career officer who epitomized the brute autocracy of the Tsarist era with a particular taste for violence, seems to have been motivated by the January 1905 Bloody Sunday clampdown on the revolutionary movement in Russia. As the commander of the Cossacks, he was in a position to coordinate the Shah's intent with the wishes of the Russian authorities in Tiflis and St. Petersburg, perhaps even the approval of Tsar Nicholas II himself. Russian authorities were anxious to wipe out a revolutionary movement that could reignite unrest in the Caucasus. To them, the fall of Muhammad Ali Shah seemed a dear loss, not only because the Iranian radicals and the Baku revolutionaries would have gained the upper hand, but also because it could potentially strengthen the chances of the pro-British Zell al-Sultan. Once the Shah stormed out of Gulistan Palace in protest and began to fortify himself in the Bagir Shah royal compound to the northwest of the capital, it became evident to all but a few reconciliating deputies of the Majlis that the royalists were preparing for a violent showdown with the Majlis, the Anjumans, and the advocates of republicanism. And remember from last time, the Anjumans are these radical sort of political societies that are forming in opposition to the Qajar dynasty. The Shah was surrounded by the Cossack elites and regular troops who were anxious to move against the Majlis. In response, the armed supporters of the Anjumans, who identified themselves as Mojaheds or Crusaders, took positions on the roof and minarets of the Grand Niziri Mosque, later known as Sepa Salah Mosque, adjacent to the Majlis. As a consolatory gesture, some Majlis deputies, still hopeful of reconciling with the Shah, managed to persuade most of the fighters to abandon their posts, hence inadvertently exposing the Majlis to an artillery assault. On June 23, 1908, Cossack forces, as many as 2,000 cavalry and infantrymen, carrying 4 pieces of artillery, surrounded the Majlis and the roads leading to Baharistan Square. The remaining Mujahedin fighters were ready to engage, even though they were reluctant to aim at the Russian officers out of fear of graver consequences. Yet once fighting started, they offered a fierce resistance that lasted 4 hours and cost at least 40 lives, mostly on the Cossack side. In response, Lyakov ordered the bombardment of the Majlis and surrounding buildings. The Majlis building, a handsome early example of Perso-European architecture, was severely damaged. Having demolished the symbol of the constitutional regime, the troops swarmed in and looted whatever they could, as they also did with the surrounding buildings occupied by the Anjumans and their fighters. To intimidate the general public, the troops then embarked on a bloody campaign of rape, pillage, and killing in the neighbourhoods adjacent to the Majlis. Qajar cities were not unfamiliar with government troops' harassment and ransacking of neighbourhoods, yet the show of force by the Russian Cossacks was novel, the first to bear the ominous signs of a modern military coup. Taking advantage of the coup in Tehran, royalists coordinated efforts in Tabriz, Shiraz, Zanjan, Isfahan, Kerman, and Rasht by clamping down on the constitutionalists. A handful of deputies were trapped in the Majlis, as well as the 2 Mujtahids, Syed Muhammad Tabatabai and Syed Abdullah Bebahani, who had come to give their moral support and prevent the bloodshed. Again, if you remember from last time, these 2 Mujtahids were the leading reformist clerics who supported the constitutional reforms. The journalist Jahangir Shirazi and the revolutionary preacher Malik al-Mutakalimin, fearing arrest outside, had taken sanctuary in the Majlis. To escape, they cut a hole in the back wall and rushed to take shelter in the surrounding houses, only to be swiftly betrayed and rounded up, battered and arrested by the Cossack detachments. At least 30 of the most vocal revolutionaries were arrested and detained in the Bagir Shah compound, where they were further beaten, interrogated, tortured, and detained. The few who were alerted in advance of the ensuing coup, including Takizadeh, took refuge in the British and French legations, and a handful managed to escape the capital and leave the country. The remaining deputies stayed home unharmed. The 2 among the Bagir Shah detainees, the revolutionary preacher Malik al-Mutakalimin and the journalist Jahangir Khan Shirazi, topped the Shah's blacklist. They were unceremoniously executed by strangling shortly after their arrival in the Bagir Shah. Suspected of Babi affiliation, even though they most likely were both agnostics, they were easy and legitimate prey, used to instill terror in the hearts of the public. The other revolutionary preacher, Jamal al-Din Isfahani, another Balbi suspect who had fled the capital, was captured in the western town of Burujerd and swiftly put to death by the governor of the province with the Shah's approval. 2 other journalists were murdered in prison. The rest of the detainees, including the 2 Mujtahids, were gradually released and sent into exile, and a few were employed by the Shah as go-betweens to the remnants of the Majlis deputies. The newspapers were all closed down, and the Anjumans were declared illegal. 2 royal announcements proclaimed that, with the removal of the heretics and agitators, the Shah intended to restore the correct constitutional regime within 3 months. The royalist coup, the bombardment of the Majlis, and the executions had the effect of terrorising the public into silence, at least in the capital. People began to go about their business again, and the Tehran Bazaar reopened with a sense of relief, with Nuri and growing contingency of clergy fully integrated into the royalist camp, and having abandoned for the most part their Mazrouet objective in favour of Qajar absolutism. There were hopes that Muhammad Ali Shah would consolidate his reign. Some sycophants among the Majlis deputies began to ingratiate themselves with the Shah, who liked to believe, at least for the sake of appearances, that he favoured the constitutional regime. He declared, in conformity with Nuri's propaganda, that he was against the prevalence of the radicals, heretics, and anarchists. The royalists needed such rhetoric for domestic consumption, but also to improve their tarnished image abroad. Although the coup was welcomed in St. Petersburg's conservative circles, it was frowned upon in London and elsewhere. Save a handful of liberals in the Persia Committee, formed in October 1908 in support of the Iranian constitutionalists, the European public was prepared to forget about Iran and its revolution. Most significantly, the great scholar and supporter of Iranian revolution, Edward Granville Brown, protested the brutal clampdown in numerous pamphlets and newspaper articles. If it were not for the popular resistance that soon reignited in Tabriz and thereafter in Rasht and Isfahan, constitutionalism seems to have lost. And indeed, I'll come back to Edward Granville Brown later in the stream. There was also a sense of relief among the public, who hoped to see an end to chaos and a return to the relative calm and security of earlier decades. Growing harassment in towns and villages by plundering tribal horsemen and armed bandits, encroaching Kurdish irregulars and Russian frontier guards in the northern provinces, killed thousands and ravished the countryside. The Majlis' failure to deliver remedies to the country's economic and social needs was an added source of public frustration. By the time of the coup, it was as though the whole mystique of the Majrouter had been spoiled, if not lost altogether. So with that, we can see that the Shah, with Russian aid, has launched this sort of brutal crackdown to reassert his power and position. And what we're seeing is that most of the moderates who were originally pro-constitution now revert back to the Shah because he appears to be ascendant, well, at least in the capital. However, throughout the provinces of Iran, you start to see more organised resistance spring up. Most notably, you see this amongst Anjumans in the city of Tabriz in Azerbaijan, and then the Bakhtiari tribe in the sort of southern and central parts of the country. And so it's prominent to know because Tabriz, as I've discussed previously in the series, was the largest city, and it was well connected with Western trade. So the merchants were the chief financiers of the Constitutional Revolution, and they would obviously use their money to sponsor a lot of domestic sort of violence and uprising against the Shah's forces. And I named this stream Persia's Days of Rage, and that's quite deliberate because that's a reference to a book by it's by an American writer called Brian Burroughs, which is all about radical, violent left-wing terror in America in the 60s and 70s. And it's a book that's talked about a lot online, in particular by my friend Raging Mandrel. He's actually doing a series where he's reading through the entire book. And I'm just trying to draw like a comparison because I have to say that this period with the minor tyranny and the revolutionaries' response to it, it does seem very Days of Rage because you're going to get these sort of grand sort of political violence and conflicts between these various sort of organized groups and the government forces. And so in terms of the actual resistance fighters, they are nominally made up of most of the Tabriz city poor. You also have some clergy locally do support the Shah and his government because most of the mujtahids, again, are broken into these two sort of camps. You have the Usuli, who are the traditionalist mullahs, and then you have the Shaikhti, who are the more reformist mullahs. And both of them, of course, organize their lutis or brigands to fight each other. And so you have full-on bedlam in Tabriz at this time. And what the most notable lutis of the Shaikhti neighborhoods were those of Amirkiz and Kayaban, and they're led by two leaders here I have on the left, Asata Khan and Baka Khan, respectively. The revolutionaries would ultimately describe their movement as the Mazrouter Hanan, or the supporters of the constitution, and called the Shah and his forces the Moshtabedin, or supporters of the tyranny. The revolutionaries are able to capture the Tabriz Argol citadel with its secure position and weapon stockpile, and they're able to fully barricade the wards loyal to them. And what's also interesting is they call themselves Fadai, or devotees. So again, both sides, the royalists and the revolutionaries, are trying to consecrate their movement in, sort of Shiite political terms, as if to sort of present, a kind of the moral high ground in this situation. And so from this point, the Shah, Muhammad Ali, he sends several regiments and his Shah-Sivan irregular cavalry to Tabriz in order to secure the city. However, the Fadayi are able to doggedly resist, and they become rather adept at urban warfare, and they eventually able to professionalize their forces. The fighting is particularly brutal, with several lulls from July to October 1908 and January to March 1909. And to make the matter worse for the Shah, the Fadayi are reinforced by several Caucasian radicals from Russian Transcaucasia, who supply more manpower and weapons. And their morale actually improves around this time due to the Young Turk Revolution, where you see something very similar happen. You have this sort of, albeit sort of national reformist revolution against the entrenched monarchy. In the case of the Ottomans, it's Abdulhamid II. There's an attempted counter-revolution by Abdulhamid, but that he ended up going too far, and the army then coup and overthrow him and replace him with Mehmed V, who was more or less a figurehead monarch. And we see a very similar situation play out in Iran with the deposition of Muhammad Ali Shah himself and his replacement with his son Ahmad Shah, who was again a child and more or less a figurehead. So it's very interesting sort of parallels going on here. And though the Shah has the support of the Russians and has obviously the larger, more professional forces, they're not able to gain a decisive victory over the constitutionalists, and they get bogged down in both Isfahan and in the city of Rust, as well as Tabriz. And it's at this point the Russians, though they are nominally backers of the Qajar monarchy, because the country is devolving into anarchy and instability, they decide to invoke the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907, which gives them the right to militarily intervene in the northern portion of Iran. They marched their own forces into Tabriz in April 1909 to enforce a ceasefire, and so ultimately they're doing this to try and stabilize the country and prevent infighting. But all this does is undermine the Qajars and the royalist forces, because they're not able to effectively finish off the rebels. And so, in my opinion, I think the Russians make a bit of an own goal with that move. And it's at this point that the Bakhtiari tribe under Ali Koili Khan Sadr Asad, later known as the Sepah, they intervene on the side of the constitutionalists, and they use their cavalry horsemen on the right to move in and capture Isfahan, which is right in the middle of Iran. So again, you've got the Fadayi in Tabriz, and then you've got the Bakhtiari from the south. You're starting to get this strategic encirclement of Tehran. And then in Rusht, which is in the east, you have a Ghulam Hossein Khan Turnakaboni. He defects to the constitutionalists as well, and he secures the area with his own tribal forces. And so you have this complete encirclement of Tehran. And then at this point, there's a joint Anglo-Russian memorandum urging Muhammad Ali Shah to restore the constitution, again, to enforce the stability in the country. And is at this point, I do want to do another reading from Amanat. And so on this point here, we've got this painting called The Triumph of Tehran. So this is a painting that commemorates the victory of the constitutionalists in the over the Shah and the restoration of the Majlis and the constitutional system. Okay. The restoration of the constitution. On July the 13th, 1909, the nationalist forces, as they collectively came to be known, headed jointly by Sadr Asad and Sepah finally entered the capital. The skirmishes south of Tehran with the demoralized Cossack regiments headed by Russian officers and regular government troops were indecisive, despite months of repeated Russian and British warnings that jointly and individually demanded that the nationalists stay away from the capital. A force of nearly 3,000 Bakhtiari and Gilan fighters engaged for 2 days in a mopping up operation inside the capital. Colonel Lyakov and his troops surrendered, only to be commissioned, ironically, back into the service by the nationalists, even though they momentarily faded out of the revolutionary limelight. Muhammad Ali Shah himself and an entourage of 500, including his hated army chief Hossein Pasha Amir Bahadur Young, negotiated his way to the Russian legation, where he took refuge under the joint protection of the two powers. Conscious of European sensitivities, the nationalists quickly secured diplomatic missions and assured the safety of foreign residents, even before marching to the ruins of the Majlis building, where on July 15th they officially announced the abdication of Muhammad Ali Shah from the Qajar throne. With a discipline that impressed even the most of the hostile European press corps, the Bakhtiari tribesmen and the contingent of the Armenian fighters from Gilan restored order in the capital, set up a rudimentary headquarters, and soon declared Muhammad Ali Shah's minor son, Sultan Ahmed, as the new Shah. The elder of the Qajar tribe, Ali Reza Azud al-Mulk, became his regent. By any account, the success of the nationalist forces was impressive. There was no looting, revenge killing, or retaliation. Even more remarkable was the level of cooperation between the heterogeneous rank and file of Gilani and Bakhtiari fighters, who could barely communicate with one another in Persian. The conquest of Tehran was an ephemeral but defining moment in Iran's modern history. Soon after the arrival of the Tabriz fighters and their heroes, Sattar Khan, now celebrated as Sardar Meli, national commander, and his colleague Bakir Khan as Salah Mili, national chief, instilled a spirit of optimism in the hearts of many Iranians, deposing Muhammad Ali Shah and his Mazrouei ally, despite Russia's unabashed backing of the royalists, was a rare triumph in the age of high imperialism. For a moment, it seems as if the desire to create a liberal democratic order had overcome not only the impediments of arbitrary rule and reactionary ulama, but also brutish European imperial ambitions. It was as though, through a national struggle and its narrative of salvation, the beast of misrule and misery had been subdued and a new road to prosperity paved. The new Ahmed Shah was hailed as a constitutional monarch, despite some talk of republicanism in the radical circles. But ultimately, Ahmed Shah is a child, and he's more or less a figurehead monarch, and it's perfect for the constitutionalists because now there's no chance that he's going to be able to, exert himself against the constitutional regime that's now been re-established. And in my view, for all intents and purposes, this is the de facto. You could say rather this is the de facto end of Qajar power. The de jure end wouldn't come until 1925 with Ahmed Shah's deposition and replacement by Reza Khan. But the nationalists maneuvering to power and the level of independence their leaders displayed took the representatives of Russia and Britain by surprise and generated much dismay. Russia had only complied grudgingly with restoration of the constitution and abdication of the former Shah, and Britain was not far behind. By the time Tehran was taken by the nationalists, at least 3,000 Russian troops had already crossed the border and occupied northern Iran, stretching from Azerbaijan to Gilan and northern Khorasan, and advancing as far south as Kazvin, only 95 miles from the capital. The audacity with which Imperial Russia trampled Iran's sovereignty, contrary to the terms of the Anglo-Russian agreement, ensuring the opposite, apparently required not even a diplomatic fig leaf. No longer shackled by a British counteraction, the Russian move had already cast its shadow over the newly restored but fragile regime. It also heightened anti-Russian sentiments that had been boiling up since the turn of the 20th century. Iranians admired by Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and saw it as a promising sign that the European expansionist empire could be defied, if not defeated. Earlier defeats of the British colonial army in the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1902 stirred similar sentiments. Even worse than Russian intervention, now masked as preserving its interests, were the Russians' profound cultural biases. The condescension of diplomatic communiques about the nationalist advances and their eventual victory was outdone only by the hostile reporting of newspapers such as the Times of London and echoed by the New York Times, among others. That the Iranians could resist, fight back and defeat a regime, militarily backed and financially buttressed by European imperial powers, was something that could not be easily accepted or forgiven. Evoking familiar Orientalist paradigms, there was an obsessive anxiety that the safety of the European residents in Tehran would be violated by hordes of nomadic invaders and socialist radicals. Their expressed disbelief that the capital could be captured without bloodshed was even more telling, while at the same time they conveniently ignored the arrival of the Russian invaders in the north. Reading between the lines, one can see in the begrudging expressions of approval for the nationalist success a sceptical dismissal that the constitutional project could never succeed, as if a scheme to destroy this delicate chance was already lurking in the back of the diplomats' minds. The coverage of the Tabriz resistance, the recapture of Tehran, and the downfall of Muhammad Ali Shah inaugurated Iran's first major exposure in the international press, making front-page headlines. A handful of correspondents from English, Russian, and French dailies and freelance observers with diverse viewpoints brought to Western audiences the unfolding of a struggle that contradicted stereotypes of indolence and deceit, meticulously crafted over centuries and even admitted by Iranians in their own narratives of decline. Now there was a new revolutionary resolve, apparent even in the midst of the civil war, awaiting the final assault on the Tehran in his camp outside the capital. Sardar Assad, the French-educated Bakhtiari Khan, daringly replied to the English and Russian representatives who were warning him of the dire consequences of storming the capital. In one sentence, "On se verra à Tehran, see you in Tehran." Contrary to the cynicism of most European observers, and contrary to perceptions of failure in later historiography, the Emergency Committee, formed just after the conquest of the capital, mustered an impressive list of accomplishments to restore calm and security to the terrorized capital. The committee put Yaprem Khan, an Armenian revolutionary commander originally from the Ganjir province, today in the Republic of Azerbaijan, in charge of Tehran's police department. With his aides among the rash fighters, he quickly ended the looting and terrorizing by government troops, by irregulars disbanded after the collapse of the old regime, and by the newly arrived revolutionary forces. The Committee, or Supreme Council as it came to be known, consisted of the two nationalist leaders and a number of ministers from among the younger bureaucratic elite. Soon to be dominated by Takizadeh, who had returned from his exile, he would be the leader of the Social Democrat faction. The committee came to play a major part in the days after the restoration of the constitution, allowed ministers to its members, but avoided appointing a prime minister, and it successfully negotiated the terms for the exile of the deposed Shah. Through the mediation of the two powers, the committee granted the deposed Shah a hefty salary and saw that he would be deported along with his entourage. Once a revolutionary cabinet was formed with Sepahrdar as premier, the electoral law was swiftly revised to replace the 7 classes of deputies of the first Majils, and with direct representation, a nationwide election was held, and by November 1909, the second Majlis was in session. More symbolic and more daring were the trials held shortly after the nationalist victory. To the Supreme Council's credit, a national amnesty was declared, and there was hardly any vengeful killings. Only a handful of reactionaries were arrested and tried. Of the 5 who were executed by order of a special tribunal on specific charges of murdering constitutionalist protesters in the sanctuary of Abdelazim during the final days of the old regime, the most prominent was Sheikh Fazullah Nuri, the relentless opponent of the constitutionalists. The tribunal held as proof of its verdict Nuri's fatwa to the effect that killing the protesters in the sanctuary was lawful. It hence underscored the new regime's wishes not to punish anyone for ideological orientation. In the final months of the so-called minor tyranny, as the period of the civil war came to be known, Nuri had abandoned his earlier call for Mazroueh in favour of the old absolutist order and avowed support for Muhammad Ali Shah's suppression of the constitutionalists. With particular zeal, he orchestrated clerical positions from the growing number of clergy in Tehran and elsewhere expressing loyalty to the Qajar regime and warning the Shah of any compromise that might result in a restoration of the constitution. Hanged by the gallows in Tubkhana Square, in front of the day's public witnessing the unprecedented execution of a Mojtahid, one of the most prominent Shiite jurists of his time, the execution was emblematic of changing times. It seems as though the kinship and the clergy, the two pillars of the ancient Iranian order, were cracked, if not shattered, by the contingencies of a modern revolutionary movement. Another encouraging sign of change was the diversity of voices in the public sphere, the growth of the press and publications, the emergence of parliamentary factions and political parties. The first audible pleas of women protesting society's misogynistic norms and the greater sophistication in cultural and political discourse were evident and seemingly irreversible. By the end of 1909, there were half a dozen dailies and growing number of book titles catering to a large readership. In the following months and years, despite major upheavals, the number of newspapers multiplied, and although many of them were short-lived, they demonstrated not only a new relish in the freedom of expression, even freedom to slander, but also the potency of the press in fashioning the country's nascent public opinion. Among the most articulate was the new daily Iran-i-Noor, New Iran, edited by the formidable Azerbaijani socialist Mohammad Armin Razulzadeh, who later was a founding father of the Azerbaijan Socialist Republic. Iran-i-Noor offered domestic and international coverage coverage, acute political analysis, and debates on poverty, corruption, elitist polity, conservative Islam, and women's rights. Yet there was a limit to how far the burgeoning press could challenge the time-honored sanctions. Already in late 1909, largely to counterbalance the effects of Nuri's execution and to exonerate itself as the guardian of Islam, the revolutionary regime convicted a leading journalist at the time, Hassan Mayed al-Islam Kashani, editor of the celebrated Hab al-Matian, of blasphemy. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for alleging in a rhetorical piece that the religions of the 7th century Arabs and the subsequent primacy of Islamic conservatism were at the root of Iran's backwardness and steady decline. Wherever its historical accuracy, such claims, ironically made by a man whose title meant confirmer of Islam, heralded the agnostic, even anti-Islamic propensity among modernists of the period. Idealizing the ancient Iranian past as an alternative to its recent Islamic legacy was become a pillar of Iranian conscious nationalism in the post-colonial period. More immediately, however, the episode foreshadowed the clashes in the political arena between the conservatives and progressives. So with that, we are starting to see, obviously, the re-establishment of the Majlis and the constitutional order, but we are starting to see the radicalization of this political system, with the radicals starting to push for even more, and even executing their sort of Mullah and Mojtahid opponents. But ultimately, the second Majlis would only last for 2 years, when it would be shut down and the constitution suspended in 1911. So leading up to that, within this sort of 2 years of the second Majlis, the two main factions were the moderates, or the Etedaliyun, and the Social Democrats, the Ejtemaiyun Amiyan. The former were comprised of landowners, tribal leaders, and younger Qajar elite. And they were even included Sattar Khan and Bakr Khan, funnily enough. And the latter, the Social Democrats, were comprised of intellectuals and socialists, and they were largely inspired by European thought, the Transcaucasian radicals over the border in the Russian Empire, and the Young Turk Revolution. Both parties agreed on some points, namely the need for a united national army to secure peace, a centralization of the finances, and the increase of revenues through an efficient taxation, and the creation of a truly national bank. Because remember, at this time, the National Bank of Iran, or the Imperial Bank of Persia, was under nominal British control. However, the Social Democrats also wanted other radical reforms in addition. They wanted land reform, the elimination of all hereditary privileges, a public education system, state-backed social reform, and for the full inclusion of women in the public spaces. The conflict and tension between these factions sort of breaks out further when Behbahani, one of the original leaders of the revolution, is assassinated in June 1910 by Qajar Khan Amoglu, a Caucasian socialist who had been given approval by Taqizadeh, the Social Democrat leader. The other Mojtahid leader, Tabatabai, had retired by this point, so he's out of the picture. Another figure at this time, Mullah Muhammad Kazim Khorasani, who had been a formerly pro-constitutional cleric, he denounces the murder of Behbahani, and alongside many other anti-constitutionalist and rival mujtahids. So again, you're seeing despite there being the split between the more conservative mullahs and the more reformist mullahs, the radical behaviour of these, sort of secular, sort of nationalists and socialists is pushing the more moderate mujtahids into forming essentially a united front with their more conservative colleagues, and that's something we'll see later in Iranian history when we get to the Iranian Revolution of '79. There would actually then be street clashes between the Fada'i and the Bakhtiari tribesmen. The Fada'i had tried to extort the rich in Tehran to make it feel like their lack of funds, but they're crushed when government troops defect and side with the Bakhtiari, and they're driven out. And the Fada'i are ultimately disarmed and disbanded, and the Caucasian radicals are exiled back to the Russian Empire. And this period is incredibly unstable due to the new government elite and the Majlis. And between March 1907 to November 1911, when the second Majlis was shut down, Iran would have 11 prime ministers. And sort of the final section I want to do for this stream is look at two sort of Western figures that were prevalent at this time, especially with their sympathies to the constitutionalists and what they were trying to achieve. So we have William Morgan Schuster, who is a American fellow who was actually made the treasurer for the Iranian government to help try and reform the finances. And you have Edward Granville Brown, who I mentioned earlier, who is a British historian and intellectual Orientalist. He'd been to Iran many times in the past and had travelled throughout the country. And so I just want to do another reading from Amanat on what's known as the Schuster episode. So just let me find my page. Following an initiative in the Majlis to reform the country's finances and the urgency for an efficient system of revenue collection, the Iranian legation in Washington, D.C., asked the US State Department to recommend an American financial advisor to serve as Treasurer General of Iran. William Morgan Schuster, a banker who had also served in the US government with integrity and candor, was recommended at a time when Iranian finances were suffering from diminishing income, the obligation to service foreign loans, and growing expenses. Iranian public finance, fiscal policy, and tax collection, though partially improvised by greater centralization, still suffered from the arcane practices of the state accountants. Employing an American expert was thought to be prudent because it would have saved Iran from pressures exerted by the neighboring powers. So again, by bringing in an American, they hoped to provide a counterweight to the British and Russian influence in the country. Schuster's arrival stirred excitement among nationalists while causing anxiety for both representatives of the powers and their Iranian associates. A man of frank demeanor and daring initiatives, Schuster and his American team represented the first serious involvement of the United States in Iran, albeit as a purely private initiative. Before then, the US presence in Iran had been limited to a few non-governmental areas, including American Presbyterian missionaries who had been active in northwestern Iran among the Nestorian Christians since the 1830s. Later in the 19th and early 20th centuries, modern American missionary schools in Urmia, Tabriz, Hamadan, and Tehran educated non-Muslims and eventually Muslim girls and boys. Though negotiations to establish diplomatic relations went back to an unratified Treaty of Commerce and Navigation from 1856, it was only in 1883 that formal relations between the United States and Iran materialized. Even then, despite Iran's repeated attempts under Nasser al-Din Shah to engage the United States in trade, finance, and security, even offering the right to a naval presence in the Persian Gulf to counter British predominance, there was a serious reluctance on the side of the Americans to cross into the traditionally recognized Anglo-Russian zones of influence. Recommending Schuster, even though he was first cleared with the British embassy, indicated a cautious change in American attitudes toward the emerging democratic regime in Iran. From the start, Schuster rebuked Iran's chaotic finances, political vacillation, and the infirmity of the government and the Majlis. He was outspoken in his critiques of the imperial powers and their discriminatory practices. In his 1912 The Strangling of Persia, published just after his forced departure from Iran, he gave a vivid portrayal of the Iranian plight in the face of European aggression. He dedicated his book to the Persian people who, by their unwavering belief, under difficult and forbidding circumstances, employed him to help with the task of the reorganization of their nation. In the foreword to the book, he expressed deep disappointment at being forcibly deprived of the opportunity to finish this intensely interesting task in that ancient land, where two powerful and presumably enlightened Christian countries played fast and loose with truth, honour, decency, and law, one at least hesitating not even at the most barbarous cruelties to accomplish its political designs and to put Persia beyond hope of self-reorganization. In a passionate plea to his American readers, he then stated, "The constitutionalists of modern Persia would not have lived, struggled, and in many instances died entirely in vain, if the destruction of Persian sovereignty shall have sharpened somewhat the civilized world's realization of the spirit of the international brigandage which is marked in the Weltpolitik of the year 1911. The lightly veiled reference to Britain and Russia, and especially the latter's hostility towards Iran's constitutional regime, reflects not only Schuster's anti-imperialist sentiments, but also the nature of troubles that he and his American colleagues faced the moment they set foot on Persian soil. Even before he began the financial reorganization, most of his time and energy during his stay from May 1911 to January 1912 was wasted resisting greedy high officials and the intrigue of the two powers. Preying on the bankrupt treasury, the old elite hoped to secure even more loans, this time £4 million or $20 million from a private English financier. Moreover, Schuster's effort to organize a new gendarmerie force under the Treasury led to an acute crisis that threatened the very survival of the constitutional regime. Shortly after Schuster's arrival, a counter-revolutionary movement reached its peak in July 1911, when the deposed Muhammad Ali Shah, who had resided in Odessa in Ukraine since his abdication, arrived in the small Caspian port of Gomesh-Tapir in northeastern Iran near Astarabad aboard a Russian steamship. Aided by a few thousand Turkmen tribesmen, he marched towards Tehran. At the same time, his brother Abul Fath Mirza Salah al-Dawla, mobilizing the Kurdish tribes of the northwest, occupied the western city of Kermanshah and advanced towards Tabriz and Hamadan. The initiative to restore Muhammad Ali or his brother to the Qajar throne enjoyed more than an implicit blessing from St. Petersburg. Predictably, the news of these advances plunged Tehran into panic. The revolutionary government feared the vim of a Russian reprisal more than the vigour of Turkmen and Kurdish horsemen. Moreover, it could not secure from the representatives of the two powers even verbal condemnation of the pincer assault on the constitutional government, despite their commitments to bar the deposed Shah from ever returning to Iran. The government in Tehran, surrounded by remnants of old Qajar loyalists in the capital, in desperation mobilised an assortment of Bakhtiari horsemen fresh from Isfahan, police detachments under Yeprim Khan, and Armenian volunteers from the Caucasus to march against the counter-revolutionary hordes who were less than 30 miles from the capital. Persuaded by Schuster, Tehran also issued a public warrant for Muhammad Shah dead or alive, setting a prize of 100,000 tumans, or $237,000. In a brief engagement, the commander of Muhammad Ali Shah's forces was captured and shot, even before his retreating horsemen arrived back to their base north of Astarabad on the Russian side of the frontier. The deposed Shah boarded the same steamship and fled back to Russia, then Europe. He died in 1925 in exile in San Remo, Italy. Soon after his retreat, Salah al-Dawla was defeated south of Tehran and fled abroad. The deployment of a Maxim gun operated by a German artillery instructor who was serving with Yeprim's troops inflicted a swift military defeat on Salah al-Dawla's forces. A major blow to the constitutionalists, however, was the loss of Yeprim Khan. In May 1912 was killed in the course of engagement. By October 1912, all aspirations for restoring the Al-Shian regime had dissipated. And so we can see there that that ultimately sort of Schuster is coming in with, ostensibly very good intentions to try and better reform and fix the Iranian finances. And it's just very interesting, this relationship America's developing with Iran at this time, because obviously we know what would happen later with the Operation Ajax and the 1953 coup and the supposed exploitation of Iran's oil resources by the Western powers, predominantly the British and Americans. So it's just interesting to see how this sort of relationship went from one of as a sort of a sympathetic aid to outright exploitation later. And so what ultimately leads to sort of Shuster's exile and deposition from his office. So the Russian consul in Tehran issues an ultimatum in October 1911 that orders Shuster to confiscate the property of Salah al-Dawla and Shoa al-Sultana, who were the Qajar princes who had supported the restoration of Muhammad Ali. Russian troops end up occupying the property themselves, and the government formally apologizes. However, a second Russian ultimatum is then issued the following month, backed by the British, which gives three demands: that Schuster be fired from his post, Iran would allow no other foreign representatives into its government without any Anglo-Russian approval, and thirdly, that the Iran compensate Russia for the cost of stationing its troops in the country. The government wanted to concede, however, the Magyars vote to defy this resolution, but the government undermines the Magyars and concedes anyway. And it's important to note that the government at this time is dominated by the Bakhtiari tribesmen, because their land is predominantly in Khuzestan and at the site of Masjid Soleiman, where the British had discovered the first site of oil in Iran and was exploited by William Knox Darcy. And so the Bakhtiari, are going to make a good deal of money from negotiating this deal with the British, and so they want to make sure that this deal doesn't fall through by opposing British interests. And what ended up happening is, Khorasani, who's one of these reformist leaders, he himself dies, and public support for the Majlis wanes after his death. That should be noted that his death was under very suspicious circumstances, and he'd even wanted to go further and declare a jihad on Russia, though I don't think that would have served Iran particularly very well. The Russians would then end up occupying Tabriz from November 1912, and they end up finishing up where Muhammad Ali was prevented from doing so, and they completely crushed the Fadai remnants in the city. They ended up destroying a significant chunk of Tabriz. They committed much rape and slaughter. and then the Russians had an army of 20,000 to occupy northern Iran, and that army of occupation would remain until the October Revolution. And they would also plunder Mashhad, which includes the shrine of the Musa al-Rida, and obviously is one of the holiest places in Shia Islam, because it also contains the shrine of the sixth Imam, if I recall correctly. The British themselves send their own military forces in. They send sepoy Indian regiments into Isfahan and Shiraz. The ulama tried to order a boycott against the occupiers, and all the bazaars are shut. The Premier Najaf Qoli Khan Samson al-Sultana, he refuses to resign throughout the crisis, and then orders the Humayun regiment to occupy and formally disband the Majlis upon the pain of death. And the constitution is formally suspended, and this is done to ultimately avoid a Russian occupation of the capital. So despite the best efforts of the constitutionalists, they are first defeated by Muhammad Ali Shah, then after he's undermined by the Russians and British, the Russians and British then come in themselves and then overthrow the constitutional order anyway. And it's sort of worth going over some of the Persian sentiments into this at this time, and further elaborating on sort of Shuster's own, what he made of the situation. So, because there was a Persian poet, or great, what's known as a bard of the Constitutional Revolution, named Abul Qasim Arif Kazvini. He composes a song. The music for this doesn't survive, but the lyrics do. So, shame on the house that let the guest leave the table. Renounce life and let not the guest depart. If Shuster leaves the country, Iran will be lost. O youth of the country, let not Iran be lost. The cup of our patience brimmed. For the thief wishes to rob our house with impunity. Our story will be the shame of the world history if we allow Shuster to leave Iran. And to finish off on this, I'm then going to do another final reading from Amanat, going over again Shuster's own sentiment regarding this, and elaborating more on where Edward Granville Brown will come in. In his heart-wrenching account of the suspension of the Masruteh, Shuster himself called the destruction of the democratic experience in Iran a sordid ending to a gallant struggle for liberty and enlightenment. Reflecting on his short experience, he further wrote that the Persians were unskillful in the practical politics and in the technique of representative constitutional government, no one could deny, but that they had the full right to develop along particular lines of their customs, character, temperament, and tendencies is equally obvious. 5 years is nothing in the life of a nation. It is not even long as a period for individual reform. Yet after a bare 5 years of effort, during which the Persian people, with all their difficulties and harassed by the so-called friendly power, succeeded in thwarting a despot's well-planned effort to wrest from their hard-earned liberties, the world is told by 2 European nations that these men were unfit, dangerous, and incapable of producing a stable and orderly form of government. This was the judgment of an American in 1912, just before the disasters that befell Iran during World War I, before the British attempt to turn Iran into a semi-protectorate in 1919, and years before the Allied occupation of Iran during World War II, before the brazen Soviet attempt to snatch away Iran's territory and subvert its government, and before Shuster's own country conspired in 1953 for Britain to deprive Iran of economic sovereignty over its natural resources and its democratic aspirations. Though I will say I do push back on this idea of America being opposed to Iran's democratic aspirations. I would say it was more Eisenhower and the CIA had concerns that Iran may have flipped and gone communist, and so the coup was there to ward off any Soviet influence that would come from such an event. It sounds almost prophetic that he concluded that Iran was the hapless victim of the wretched game of cards which a few European powers, with the skill of centuries of practice, still play with weaker nations as the stake, and the lives, honour, and progress of the whole races as forfeit. Shuster's was not the only voice outside Iran that supported the constitutional revolution. The most courageous and consistent, perhaps, was that of the celebrated English scholar of Iran, Edward Granville Brown. From the outset of the movement, Brown lent his moral support through correspondence with major constitutionalist players and sympathetic British diplomats in Iran. He also organised the Iran Committee in the United Kingdom in support of the revolution, sought out other voices of support in the West, responded to vicious attacks on the constitutionalists in the British press, and provided an updated narrative of the revolution in Iran as it unfolded. Brown's The Persian Revolution of 1905 to 1909, published in 1910, was a remarkable work of contemporary history based on his published pamphlets and tracts, his correspondence, and his investigative scholarship. It offered the English reader an inside view of the revolution, distinct from its direct conveyance of the ideas and feelings of the Iranians, the dilemmas and obstacles they were facing, and the prospects of their revolution as was visible by the middle of 1909. Almost an instantaneous classic, Brown's account questioned not only the imperialist biases of his own time, but also the validity of the all-embracing critiques of Orientalism and the common assumption that Orientalists invariably were pioneers of imperial hegemony. Though Brown, like most scholars of his generation, was enamored of the romantic vision of the East, his Persian Revolution was an anti-imperialist project that helped define the Mashruter as an authentic voice of protest against domestic oppression and foreign intrusion. That on the cover of his book was embossed the Persian phrase, "Long live the Iranian Constitutional Revolution," or "Payende bad Mashruter i Iran," displayed the author's sympathies for the Iranian cause. It also denoted his role in representing, free of a nefarious motive, the Iranian voice against crimes committed by the great powers in Iran, even though he and a small group of like-minded liberals failed to change the course of British foreign policy. Yet its Persian Revolution was an enduring narrative for the Iranian Revolution, one that for decades defined its forerunners, heroes, and villains. And so, as we can see there, that it's interesting, despite the actions of these Western imperial governments, you do have these sort of sympathizers within the West who were pro-constitutional revolution, and so you can see they're coming at it from certainly a very progressive slant, whereas the British and Russian politicians and officials who supported the intervention against the revolution were largely acting in their own sort of pragmatic geopolitical interests. And that's where I do want to leave it there. So a bit of a shorter stream today, but thank you everybody for watching. So for the next stream, I hope to cover the Iranian experience of World War I, and also the aftermath of World War I and the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty before Reza Shah becomes Shah in 1925. I'm just going to check for any super chats on YouTube or Entropy. Now is the time if anybody wants to ask a question that you fire away. Yeah, from what I can see, there's been no super chats on either YouTube or Entry, but that's fine. So I've not had any questions either. So yeah, again, a bit of a shorter stream today, but an important conclusion to the stream I did last time on just concluding the constitutional revolution. So yeah, thank you everybody for watching, and yeah, the next stream I hope to do probably will be before the end of this month, I imagine. Well, thank you all for watching, and good night.